dissolve. And I'm, in looking in through Florida and Georgia, where I cover most of the areas now, I expand beyond that, but there are a lot of erosion feeders out there. There are a lot of folks using trichlor tablets, and what they're going to have to do is constantly adjust those erosion feeders to compensate for the difference in the tablets dissolving. Obviously, we have a lot more surface area when the tablets are first put in. They get a lot smaller over time, and there's a lot of different adjustments to make. It's going to be challenging, and with that, I'm in favor of a much broader range. For those reasons, it's going to be something they not had to ever do before. So it's not just a question of, it's not hard to stay in between, to stay where we're at right now, the levels and the way they're maintaining it. It's not difficult right now. What we're going to have to start doing is paying a lot more attention, and you're going to be looking at a whole different type of operator. I do believe it's possible, but it's going to be definitely very challenging when you give them a much smaller window to operate within.
I just want to add something to what Dewey, what you said. We've been talking about the 30-to-1 as an example, and then you mentioned the closure CRs, but there are also other ratio proposals for the operational target that are out there, and not just the 30-to-1. There actually were a handful of them, which is what James was getting at in terms of part of what makes it very confusing, and some of the things that you guys are all up against in terms of trying to figure out what makes sense for you. I would also echo again what Tom said earlier, that whatever ratio you choose, it's not meant to be that that's the ratio you operate at, but rather the limit that you just try to stay under, which is really important point of clarification. I feel that ought to be reiterated. With regards to closure, though, Dewey, something else that you said, there is a CR out there, yes, and that talks about closure for the 300 that is based off of the EPA SWIM model. That 305, which was reduced to 300, has a built-in 100 multiple safety factor with it. So I just want to point that out. That is how those kinds of tox exposure assessments are done. That is intentional. So there's that. And then I also just wanted to add that, when we talk about closure or immediate correction, we are looking at imminent health hazards. And since you brought that up, James mentioned yesterday that some of these CRs are pretty complicated because you are looking at, with any given CR, maybe multiple changes within one change request. And so you kind of have to figure out how these different pieces all work together. The closure CR that has been submitted that talks about the 300 part per limit CYA limit is addressing, first of all, a couple gaps. One is that there isn't currently, in the current MAC, there is not a CYA limit for closure. All we have is the operational limit of 90, which previously was 100. So that's what we're looking at there. So we need to address that gap for sure, but you can't choose that CR without also making the choice of what comes with it based on the way the CR is written. And that includes the 45-to-1 for closure. And I'm not really sure what you meant about instability, and maybe Richard can speak on that a little bit, because I'm not really clear on that. But when we look upon making 45-to-1 closure, we're talking about saying that our current operational limits of 2 parts per million measured free chlorine and 90 parts per million cyanuric acid warrant immediate correction or closure based on an imminent health hazard. So we're saying that our current operational limits, justify an enforceable hard limit at this point. And I will tell you, as part of the conversations and involvement that I've had with the CMAQ Chlorine Stabilizer Committee, that committee did not necessarily deem that 45-to-1 is at all an imminent health hazard. And all of them will probably tell you that it is somewhat of an arbitrary, proposal. And there isn't scientific evidence to base that, or even best practices to base that from, in terms of, an imminent health hazard or immediate correction or closure standpoint. And so if you want to be able to have, right now, if you wanted to be able to have 300 limit of cyanuric acid be instituted for closure, since there isn't currently one, you don't have the choice of a max ratio for closure that is reasonable. We all know that risk based on the model and just in general, we know that a hard limit, as you stated, is going to be significantly higher than an operational limit. But 45-1 isn't really higher. It's not hardly any higher. In fact, it's actually lower than one of the operational ratio proposals. And it's basically equivalent to our current operational limit. So it's not higher, and it really needs to be moved. And I would say that, the submitter really needs to consider changing that from 45-1 within that CR, because I agree with the other things that are in that CR. They're all solid, but that 45-1 needs to be much higher. And a much more rational proposal for that is, if you look at the current MAC with the 2 parts per million DPD FC, and the 300 parts per million of cyanuric acid that should have been there, because we don't currently have a closure limit for cyanuric acid. That's basically a 150-1 ratio. And in fact, the ad hoc committee had that previously as the agreement on that CR. So, when we look at risk and what makes sense for closure and immediate correction, we really need to have an option for a change request out there that has that available to us, because we don't currently. So I think that there needs to be strong consideration given to modifying that.
There's a lot there to unpack, and just kind of in the interest of time, I'm quite sure we will pick up there when we do the open discussion at 1 p.m. Eastern. We do have a couple of people that have been waiting in queue to speak. So I'd like to recognize June first.
Thank you, Dewey. So I am an educator as much as I am an environmental health professional. And I think that as an educator, we can educate people to do anything if we make an effort. But at the same time, I also understand that education is never easy. So as an educator, what I think is it's important for us to know why we're making this change. So when I try to sell this idea, the ratio or lowering or raising the limit on the cyanuric acid level to health inspectors and operators, what is the selling point? What's the gain? What's the public health gain that we can emphasize so that we can emphasize the importance of learning this? Seems like we don't agree on many things because we don't have enough scientific evidence to say one way or the other. I think that changing people's behavior is going to be very difficult if we don't have a strong reason for this change. Can anyone comment on that?
Hey, June, this is Ellen. I know that all the different ratios has their own proponents, right? And I'll just speak regarding that 15-1 ratio. I think it can be said pretty simply that, if you have a ratio higher than 15-1, then you sacrifice your chlorine efficacy to the point where it's not as effective as 1 part per million of chloramine for killing Giardia. So I think, it's clear we don't want to sanitize our pools with monochloramine. And so I think as far as, educating people and having a simple message, I think that one fits. But again, you need to decide whether that's, sufficient for voting for the change request or not.
Yeah, so Ellen, and Ellen works for Segura, so keep that in mind. So
Yep.
Now,
Richard, hold on. Because
we'll do it in a later discussion. Yeah,
right, because I'm trying to get to everyone that's wanting to speak. The next person I'd like to recognize is Carly Barton.
Hello, I work for Segura, which is a Cal Hypo manufacturer. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. There are some other places, or the majority of this, the ratio concept is based on, specifically in the committee that worked on this, did this for a reason, because they wanted to zero in on one particular thing, and that was gastrointestinal illness. So a lot of this, a lot of the paper and a lot of the decisions are based on the model that Richard Falk did, which is a great model. But it also kind of leaves, in my opinion, some gaps that I know that the committee is going to work on in the future. But there is some data out there that kind of supports some of these ratios. And specifically, I want to talk about Pinella study. For years, that's been kind of pointed out by ISO guys that it proves that you can run a pool with lots of cyanuric acid, which is true if you have enough chlorine in the water. So kind of looking at that data, I went through, and about 10% of the pools there failed based on heterotrophic plate counts. And when you look at this ratio concept, which is rarely ever presented to the public, you kind of hit some points where of the failures that occurred in those pools, of that 10% that failed, you hit a ratio or an HOCl concentration of 0.05, which is roughly an 8-to-1 cyanuric acid to free chlorine, which represents about 90% of the failures. If you go down to 0.02 parts per million free chlorine, or excuse me, of HOCl, which represents roughly a 20-to-1 cyanuric acid to free chlorine ratio, about 80% of the failures occur at that level or below. So there is some other data, and there are other ways of looking at this, like CT counts. Kind of, I guess, what Ellen was pointing out with the 15-to-1 ratio is as effective as chloramines. We can look at those CT counts, and we can figure out, is our primary sanitizer going to kill this in X amount of minutes? And we have pathogens that we're interested in that are it's common practice to look at it that way, to look at those pathogens. It's common practice to look at the CT values and say, how long is it going to take us to kill these things? And kind of my thought on that is that we have a limit that on secondary disinfection, that it should kill whatever pathogens we're trying to kill within 24 hours. So that's another way of looking at it. Is our primary sanitizer going to kill these pathogens in 24 hours? Is it going to be less effective than a secondary disinfectant? So there's some other things to look at. And I do want to point out that what Michelle said about the slower implementation, I think that's a great idea. To come out and say, we're going to make this change this year, as soon as it comes out, and you guys adopt this, then you have to make that change. But I guess to that point, that whatever this MAC comes out, unless the AHA has actually adopted the entire MAC, because we're going to do whatever's in the MAC, then those municipalities are going to have to adopt. They're going to have to look at this and say, well, I agree with this or I disagree with this. So it's not going to be immediate for everybody. And I don't know of any municipalities that just say whatever it says in the MAC, that's what we're going to do. But I do think that having a slower implementation process, or saying, hey, we want this to be implemented in a year, 2 years, whatever we decide, I think that's a great way of doing it. I wanted to make a point on operational costs, specifically as far as draining water. In many cases, as some of the people have said, people are already running their pools above the minimum ratio that we're talking about. The draining of the water, in many cases, it's going to be backwashing instead of 10 minutes, maybe 17 minutes or 15 minutes to maintain these cyanuric acid levels. And I know Rudy has been doing a lot of work on a way to remove cyanuric acid using alum. So if he could speak to that at some point today, I think that he's the one that's looked at the data, he's the one that's generated it. I think that there are other options besides just draining or there appear to be other options other than just draining the pool that would have much less cost impact on the operational standpoint. And to that point, the people who are running the pools day to day should have a say on. They should be part of the conversation to say, well, I think this ratio is going to cause an undue burden on my ability to operate using this sanitizer or that. So I would like to hear what they have to say, because I haven't heard it. And those are my things.
I'll be happy to speak on that later if we have time, or anybody who wants to catch up with me individually. I'm happy to explain with them, and some of you know already, but through the process of what we've been doing with alum to lower cyanuric acid.
We can, talk about that in the afternoon session, Rudy.
That's
We
fine.
have time before our caucusing for one more speaker. I want to recognize Vince Hill.
Hey, sorry, Dewey, I don't know that I probably didn't take my hand down. Did I have to do that? Sorry, somebody else can speak.
Okay, then Tom, your hand is up.
Okay, thank you. I want to kind of go back to the EPA limit, and not sure if Michelle's still on, but certainly in the conversation with EPA is going to have to involve the ratio concept. 10 parts per million of free chlorine with no cyanuric acid is a very different animal than 10 parts per million at a given ratio with cyanuric acid present. And, the conversation with EPA is going to have to recognize that. They're probably not going to allow 10 parts per million with no cyanuric acid in the pool.
Right, which is fine.
And that is the impetus with the ratio concept, is that we can run the
Tom, we
chlorine.
can't hear you. Are you still speaking?
Yes,
can
I
hear
am.
Tom just fine.
Yeah, me too.
So again, the conversation with EPA is going to have to involve the ratio concept, and that's the idea. So if you run up against the limit with the ratio, you can go ahead and raise the chlorine, because you can still get the same efficacy with the same ratio, even though both the cyanuric acid and the chlorine are higher. But the side effects of having high chlorine are really different depending on what ratio you're running. And so having a EPA allow a higher chlorine maximum is going to be dependent on what ratio you have in the pool as well. I'm done.
All right. Well, thanks. That was some really great discussion, everybody. And I look forward to some more. We have, a couple more hours after our caucusing breakouts right now. So we will regroup. Please join. We'll exit this meeting and join the link for your caucusing meeting. And then we'll regroup here at let's see, 1 p.m. Eastern for our open discussion, so we can finish this conversation. Thanks, everybody.